Hey everyone, welcome to Zonan Canada. I'm your host, Jesse Betteridge. This is a podcast focusing on the connections between anime and Canadian media. And in this episode, we're going to be focusing on another anime series that has had a unique cultural impact and presence in Canada, mainly because this is one of the only countries where people have actually seen it outside of Japan, or at least the English language version and the French language version as well, because this never aired in France. We're talking about Yamanezumi Rocky Chuck, or Rocky Chuck the Mountain Rat, better known in English as Fables of the Green Forest, and in French as Les Contes de la Forêt Verte. And there's also a second English dub of the series, apparently called Friends of the Forest. And I got to say right off the bat, I think that's a terrible title, because these cute little animals, for the most part, are not really friends, in my opinion. I think they would stab each other in the back in a heartbeat. But joining me for this episode, I have two very special guests. First is someone I've been hoping to get on the show for a very long time. I'm very glad he could join us today. It's Ed Conroy from Retrontario.
Thank you for having me on, Jesse. I've been running Retrontario for about 20 years now. Mm-hmm. Basically, we try to uncover and preserve as much television, pop culture, film pop culture that we can through the wonderful world of social media. We have a fleet of VCRs that are constantly converting old analog tapes to the digital format and uncovering wonderful gems along the way.
And you deal a lot with lost media, and the real lost media, not just the buzzword lost.
That's
media.
right, the real lost media. Yes, we just by its very nature come across a lot of stuff that was thought to be lost. Thankfully, now is back in circulation. So we don't focus only on that, but that is certainly a big part of what we do.
And joining us for a second time, very glad to have him back on the show. It's Etienne Desilets-Trempe, or Des, as he goes by.
Yeah, I feel like a veteran already. So I'm Des. I'm a webcomic artist from Quebec City and an all-around Japanese pop culture geek. And has been such a geek for a very, very long time. In part thanks to these old French language dubs of Japanese anime that played on TV here in the early 80s. Anime such as this show we're gonna discuss tonight.
Yeah, and you have.
I was there when it played.
You have such a critical perspective that it's very rare to hear on English language stuff like this. And also,
like I said during our, sorry, my English is broken right now, our last podcast we did together, I think French Canadians have a very unique experience with anime compared to like everybody else in North America, but also in France, because like we were at the very at the middle of like two cultures, maybe even three cultures if we count like Japanese stuff. Mm-hmm. Like we had stuff from France, we had stuff from the USA also, like stuff like Gatchaman, Battle of the Planets that reached us, but they didn't have that show in France. And this show that we're gonna discuss today didn't air in France, but I'm gonna keep that for later. So yeah, we had a pretty unique perspective, I think, when it comes to all of those old school shows.
And far more of those shows were dubbed in Quebec than some might care to admit over in France. And Des, I think actually last time we had you on, you do a webcomic and a couple other things. I didn't think we didn't get into that too much. Could you just talk about that just for a sec?
Oh yeah, but my webcomic is called Frivolesque. It's a kind of slice of life, anime inspired slice of life, kind of zany, character-based comedy featuring a bunch of girls living in Quebec City. A rare case. My work is a rare case of a piece of media set in Canada where I'm not afraid to say it's set in Canada, because I feel like usually Canadian writers like to pretend like their story could happen anywhere. It's like some weird American/Canadian vague place that doesn't have any recognizable landmarks or anything, so we don't alienate potential American audiences. I just don't care. It takes place in Quebec City. I have like a ton of French names, but I think my stuff can be enjoyed by anyone on the planet, I hope. I've been doing that for like almost 10 years, but I've been on a hiatus for a few years now. really, I'm really going to resume my work soon, though.
Yeah, the noblest of causes, in my opinion. So just to give a quick rundown of what this show is, Rocky Chuck the Mountain Rat debuted in Japan on Fuji TV January 7th, 1973. It ran for 52 episodes, animated by Zuyo Eizo, which would later become Nippon Animation, and Mushi Production, and it aired as part of the Kalpis Comic Theater block, which would later have its name changed to World Masterpiece Theater, which is what most people know it as today. And actually, Ed, I'm curious, are you familiar with World Masterpiece Theater and that whole kind of tradition in Japan?
A little bit. I did work on Beyblade for a little while, which gave me an opportunity to visit Japan and understand a little bit more about that. Yeah, it's every show in World Masterpiece Theater is based off of some piece of Western literature. Right. Each one is 52 episodes. You got things like Dog of Flanders, Heidi of the Alps, Moomin, Rascal the Raccoon, which notoriously resulted in all those raccoons being imported into Japan. These shows were all massively popular, widely viewed. The way that many Japanese children absorbed these Western stories, and obviously it's where Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki, where they sort of made their names in the animation industry in Japan as well. And this was one of those shows because it is based off of the work of American author Thornton W. Burgess, who wrote over 170 books and 15,000 stories with these characters. He was quite an amazing figure. And when it aired in Canada, the English dub aired on the provincial educational broadcasters, including TVO in Ontario, Knowledge Network in BC, Access Alberta in Alberta, and I believe on SCN as well. It debuted for the first time on TVO September 18th, 1979, and it ran very frequently and very prominently throughout most of the 1980s. The French dub was produced by Synchro Quebec. That ran on Radio Canada beginning January 9th, 1982. And I only ran for a few years on there, not as long as it did on TVO, if I recall correctly. And Fables of the Green Forest was one of the first anime to air in English on a English language Canadian broadcaster in 1978. It debuted around the same time as Battle of the Planets did on global affiliates. Before that, any anime that aired in English in Canada, you would have viewed through an American border broadcaster, or you would have got over the border with an antenna. So to start, maybe we'll just each talk a little about how we discovered the show, or how we discovered the sort of programming that this show was a part of. Ed, can you just talk about your background with Fables of the Green Forest and just TVO content in the 70s and 80s? Yeah, sure. I think, to cue it up, with TV Ontario, they have a very interesting history. They started broadcasting in 1970. They were obviously falling under the auspices of the Department of Education, or the education portfolio. So there was a real focus on educational content, even to the degree that, their programming blocks in the morning and the afternoon were aimed at children. But even their adult programming had to contain an educational component. Mm-hmm. So, for example, they showed Doctor Who in the 1970s. But after the episode was over, they had Judith Merrill, who was a noted science fiction author, discussing the episode afterwards and placing it in context of science fiction literature. So, it was a really fascinating channel. And I think what happened was a lot of parents sort of saw TV Ontario as a babysitter, an electronic babysitter for their children. And so I grew up, I was born in 76, but I have very strong memories of seeing TVO right from, my earliest childhood experiences with television were on TVO. Obviously things like Polka Dot Door, which was their version of a British series for kids. That was kind of the flagship children's program, but they did run all of these fascinating cartoons that were from around the world. And I think that's probably why a lot of people of a certain age, let's say Generation X people, have this real fondness about growing up in the 80s with TVO, because it wasn't just the usual pablum that we saw on, as you mentioned, Global or on the Buffalo channels, the usual cartoons everybody remembers from the 80s. TVO had these, British programs and French programs, things like Barbapapa, Dr. Snuggles, Paddington the Bear, and of course, Fables of the Green Forest.
I didn't know Barbapapa ever aired in English. I'm very surprised about that.
Yes,
I thought it was like super French.
Yes, well, it's funny. The English or the Canadian dubs of Barbapapa are in a similar class of lost media that we've been talking about. And there's only a few. And unfortunately, I did have some of it on the YouTube channel, but whoever owns Barbapapa is extremely litigious. And it was taken down almost immediately.
Oh, no.
Yes, unfortunately. And there's all kinds of Barbapapa fans out there that are trying to locate some of these dubs. They're very, very hard to find, but I have about 5 or 6 of them. But yes, it was really international children's programs, and where obviously it was not in English, they were dubbed versions. And so Fables of the Green Forest was, I would say, almost as important as Polka Dot Dora. It was on every day. It was on in the morning. It was on in the afternoon. It was on in the early evening. And I got to say, as a kid, I was not aware that I was watching a Japanese animated program.
That's how they get you.
Yeah, well, that to the credit of Ziv, they did a pretty great job of making it seem, I can't say making it seem American, because it didn't seem like an American show either. I think, I've read that theme song that everybody, of a certain age can recite, it has an almost otherworldly feeling to it, because the women singing it, they're not, English wasn't their first language, and they just did this wonderful job of singing it, but in a very unemotional way. And so, yeah, it was a dark show to begin with, and there was lots of violence and lots of darkness in it. But as kids, it was on TVO between Polka Dot Dora and today's special. So parents just let us watch it, but we always knew there was something is not quite right about it. It wasn't until many years later when I started to research the history of television and understand that it was a Japanese program. It was kind of a mind blower when that revelation came out.
And Des, can you talk about your early experience with it, and just, sort of where this show fell in that early 80s lineup of Radio Canada programming? I think on TVO, I believe, especially at that time, Fables of the Green Forest would have been the only anime, which is a contrast to Radio Canada, which was kind of actually almost majority anime at that time.
Yeah, this is where I wanted to go. I feel like I really grew up with a ton of Japanese anime on TV in my early childhood. I was born in 1976. By then, Radio Canada had already aired Minife, Maotsukai Sally. So the older generation already was familiar about like weird Japanese cartoon, as my mom would call them. Because unless Ed here, I was always kind of aware that Japanese animation was Japanese, because back then, like we had dubbed anime like around. I'm thinking about like my early childhood, like when I was like 5, 6, 7 in 81, 82. Like before, like the cool toy cartoons like Transformers and shit hit the scene and changed the TV landscape. We had access like to anime and like older cartoons from the US, like Hanna-Barbera and that kind of stuff, or like retro like Looney Tunes shit. So I always kind of knew that the Japanese stuff was different. And when I asked my mom, she would just say, those are like Japanese cartoon. Like Japanese are very weird. They love the melodrama. Everything is always so intense in Japanese cartoons. So I was like, oh yeah. So all of the cartoons I like the most are Japanese, apparently. And I quickly was able to like tell the difference and know those shows were Japanese in my in my very early years.
And you non-dismissively loved the melodrama and
I
all
never
these
thought of
things that are just imbued in Japanese
like
programming.
back then, I was a huge fan of Captain Harlock. Like back in 82, 83, Captain Harlock was the biggest children's cartoon on TV. And it definitely wasn't that much for children. It was kind of dark and violent and not that violent, but like definitely different from the usual like Saturday morning cartoon.
It's got some
stuff.
scenes that'll haunt your dreams for sure.
Yeah. Oh man, some scenes in Captain Harlock still haunt my dreams today. Have you ever seen the original series?
I've seen the whole thing, and I caught some of the dub on a rebroadcast on Radio Canada a few years ago.
There is a scene where one of the I'm going to just make a small segue here. There is a tangent, not segue. There is a scene where like one of the crew members of the ship falls in love with one of the bad guys, the Mazones. And she takes him to the ship, and he sees one of the Mazones getting born, and it's like some weird kind of liquid that falls into a little crater, and it turns into like a crazy, creepy alien baby. And that scene still haunts my dream to this day.
I know. I remember that part too. Yeah.
It wasn't that creepy, that scary. But for the 6-year-old kid I was, it was like mind blowing. Oh my God, this is like an alien being born. What's going to happen? You see the dad, that kind of stuff kept rolling in my head. So yeah, Le Conte de la Forêt, as it was called in Quebec, happened a little bit after those shows. I think 83, right? 81? I think
82 is when it debuted.
82.
So yeah, it was after Goldorak and Captain Harlock.
So I was very used to like sci-fi Japanese cartoon, and then suddenly that's we also had that show about Le Petit Castor, I was going to say the Little Beaver, but the show was called Dunchuck in Japan. I guess you know what it is. So we already had one show about cute forest animals on TV, and then this one happened, and I feel like it was like every kid my age remembers Le Petit Castor. It was one of everyone's favorite show in Gen X, and La Forêt Verte was definitely not as popular because face it was kind of boring. I think it was.
It's all about the context of where it's all running in, which I think is really interesting because I think it on TVO it really stands out as this sort of subdued, darker kind of show, even though it's about cute animals. On Radio Canada, it really kind of takes on a different meaning in the overall lineup because you have again a couple shows that were like it already running, and then it's running almost alongside things like Albator, Captain Harlock, and I guess like Captain Future and things like that.
I also love that one.
Yeah,
this one I used to watch with my dad. This was very special. It was the only cartoon he would watch with me. I don't know why. He liked it. He loved Captain Future.
The whole reason it was dubbed because there was just there was demand for that content. And
I was gonna say, you mentioned the World Masterpiece Theater earlier. Is it just me? You are like almost half of the anime we had on French Canadian TV was from the World Masterpiece Theater.
I don't know about half, but a good portion of it was.
A lot of them. When I became aware of that series in Japan, I was like, hey, wait a minute, all of those shows were part of this.
Yeah, certainly more of them in French Canada than in English-speaking Canada and the United States. That's actually part of what makes it so kind of fascinating to a lot of people is that they're like these huge culturally significant titles in like Quebec and Europe and Japan, and like most of them have never been seen in North America. Like the Anne of Green Gables that they produced.
That's one of them, right?
Yeah, that aired in Quebec on Radio Canada. So you could watch it in other cities and other provinces.
It did here in Radio Canada, but it aired kind of late. I think it was in 87 or 88. But it was like a 70s show in Japan, right? And
and it reran into the 90s until 97.
It was such a phenomenon over there. I feel like all of these shows,
they really were.
Everything Japan knows about the Western world came from this series. I feel sometimes.
Yeah, it was like a very prestige title, and just also to give more context to what it's airing in Japan, kind of related to what you were saying, how it was on Radio Canada. It aired just 1 hour apart from Cutie Honey on Japanese TV at that time. So just kind of gives you an idea of
We never had QTNE. I don't know why.
Oh, gee, I
Might
wonder
have
why.
been a little bit too risque for
That
French
that
Canadian
did air in
audience.
France.
Oh, I'm not surprised.
As for my own background with Fables of the Green Forest, I have to admit I had never even heard of it until I started doing this podcast, and it was brought up on the very first episode of this podcast by Emily, and I think a couple other people, as one of the first shows they had seen that was anime. And that's because I was born in 1986, so I even though it was airing on Knowledge Network in BC, it would have been before I was born, and I pretty much missed out on it. There was that alternate dub that ran. I never saw this myself, and we'll get into that a little later, I think. But that was sort of the first mention of the dub that I had heard. But before I started making the podcast in 2014, I was sort of introduced to it in a way because this show, the original Japanese version, was parodied in another anime that ran in 2014 called Shirobako, which is an anime about the animation industry. Most of the characters in it are based off of actual prolific figures in the world of Japanese animation, except for all the main characters who are cute girls who look almost the same. But it's a very entertaining show. It's very well written from Michiko Yokote, who was one of the writers on Cowboy Bebop. It's a really great show. I recommend it. The main character, Miyamori, the show that kind of inspired her to go into the industry and see anime as an art form, was called Andy's Chucky, and it's basically a parody of Rocky Chuck. Except what's funny is that Andy's Chucky in that show is depicted as being very adventurous. The scene that it sort of recreates is them venturing across a mountain. I can't even remember why. And I think it's just funny because after now sort of looking into Fables of the Green Forest, Rocky Chuck, and just seeing what the original was like, Johnny, or Rocky, whatever you want to call him, he has two different names. He's the complete opposite of that. If anything, he goes out of his way to avoid adventures. He just wants to sort of be left alone and just sort of mind his own business. One of my favorite scenes in this show is one of the last episodes when these kids come to his door. They're basically asking him to come join them and play and go on adventures and stuff. And he basically just tells them to fuck off because he has more important things to do to prepare for the winter. And he's right. And, that kind of stuff is, I think, what kind of makes this show unique and great. And, it's very similar to a lot of other World Masterpiece Theater shows in that regard, because it kind of focuses on this sort of day-to-day slice of life kind of existing in the Green Forest, which is the area around the Connecticut River is what the setting actually is in that show. And the animals just try to get by and protect themselves. They're in constant danger, but they just cooperate to the extent they need to, except for Chatterer, who is constantly diving into danger deliberately.
That's the bird, right?
Chatterer is the squirrel.
It's the squirrel. Okay.
Yeah, the bird's just he warns people of danger and annoys them as a result of warning them of danger.
So annoying.
Yeah.
Trouble.
I guess we should probably talk a little about the original books that it was based off of. It was a large number of stories. Typically, these World Masterpiece Theater titles, they will adapt one book and draw it out over 52 episodes. And as a result, they are very slow paced. Oftentimes, usually the first half of these shows will be filler or take a small part of the story and excessively drag it out and then jump forward and dash through the rest of the story at a faster pace. With this, Thornton W. Burgess, the original author, had written over 15,000 stories. Pretty much every episode is drawing from one of the original stories. And there's no sort of linear timeline to follow, really. So they just can pick and choose things and assemble it together. And I think it makes a really full, kind of rich show in its 52 episode run as a result of that. So Thornton W. Burgess was from Sandwich, Massachusetts and Cape Cod. He was born in 1874. So the most important thing about this guy is that he was a real pioneer in conservationism. He was very ahead of his time because he was spreading environmental consciousness to children through his stories and to the public in general at a time when industrialization was just being wholeheartedly embraced in a very positive way. And he was very much against the grain in just the Western world in general. And he really was one of the first people to sort of recharacterize the idea of like the great outdoors as not a place that needed to be feared and conquered, but more like a place that's filled with lots of animals who are fun to hang out with, and maybe you should empathize with a little bit. His first wife died in childbirth, and that actually led him to raising his son alone for the first few years of his son's life. And he just began writing bedtime stories for him. And he eventually started getting these stories published through his work. And that these stories became the basis of his first book, which was Old Mother West Wind in 1910. And that introduced most of the characters that you find in Fables of the Green Forest. And he basically just wrote about the environments that he grew up in and loved and appreciated. And over 50 years, from 1910 to 1960, he wrote 6 nature columns a week for daily newspapers across the United States. And he did this each and every week without fail. And he had it was a very prolific career, to say the least. Just his writing itself directly led to major conservation efforts, including the story that he wrote about duck migration and hunters, which was captured very well in one of the episodes of Fables of the Green Forest. He basically used that as a vehicle for getting readers and people who followed his stories to establish bird sanctuaries. All these conservation efforts were driven by the work he did directly and the work he did through his writing. And there's actually an entire museum devoted to him there was an entire museum devoted to him in Cape Cod. Unfortunately, it closed in 2014, so that is no longer there. But they had lots of displays and things with all the characters that you'd find in Fables of the Green Forest and his stories. And his work is all in the public domain now. You can find it all on Project Gutenberg. Unfortunately, the version that you find online doesn't have the little illustrations. But you can still buy the books. They are in print. They are available. Were either of you familiar with his stories at all? I had never read any as a child.
I had seen them in our school library, but they were like very old editions, and they were not to be handled by students. They were like I don't know if they were first edition, but I remember they were up high, in a glass cabinet. And I'll never forget making that connection that that's what it was, which again, as a kid in grade 3, it was big news in the playground that day that we had the Fables of the Green Forest books in the library.
Yeah, that's the case with a lot of the World Masterpiece Theater stuff. They are books that have fallen into obscurity or that are out of print or difficult to get. A lot of the times you have to go to the archives and libraries to read this stuff. That's when I was researching the Bush Baby for another podcast they did, which was another World Masterpiece Theater title that aired on TVO and other broadcasters in Canada. I had to basically go to the library and take pictures of it and read it later because they wouldn't even let you take it out.
Aware a lot of that series of books, and I feel kind of sad that French Canadian people were completely oblivious to such a huge body of work, and people my age all know the animated series based on it, but not the actual book it was based on. It's kind of sad.
Well, I have a couple things to say about that. One, I think that the opening credits for Fables of the Green Forest is incredibly presumptuous about how familiar children were of the stories. Because what does it say that they're the stories come to life, and it's just like
the stories you read about all
come to life, but like no one actually.
The English version.
That's the English opening credits. Yeah.
The French credits were completely different.
And also the show itself, honestly, from the little I've read of the stories and from what I've seen of the show, it does an excellent job of adapting it. It captures the characters, the setting, and just and most importantly, the conservationist message. It's instilled in it, I think, very effectively, and it is also never preachy, which is a very important thing. It tends to weave that well into the narratives, into the characters, into the probably the most compelling story thread within it, which is the characters dealing with Farmer Brown and his son Tom. One thing that's kind of lost in the English dub is that you actually never hear them speak in the original Japanese version. They're always mute. I don't know how it was in the French version because, of course, there's only one episode of French available, and I don't think,
Mhm.
and I think they don't speak in that version. Yeah, this is something the English dub kind of embellishes with a little bit, because they dub over the farmer and his son, whereas in the original Japanese version they never speak until the very end, when you finally hear Tom speak.
I really don't remember that.
Yeah, and because he's seen the light, and he can we know that he can empathize with the animals.
Mhm.
But that's kind of lost in the English dub. But that's fine. It still works.
It might have been like that in Quebec too. I feel like I think I remember the human being kind of alien in that show.
Yeah. Also, funny about the character of Peter Rabbit in Fables of the Green Forest and Burgess's work. So he effectively stole that character from Beatrix Potter. Beatrix Potter created Peter Rabbit, and he just kind of used it in his story. It was a different time for that kind of thing back then. But in the later stories, and they did an episode about this in Fables of the Green Forest, where he rebranded, I guess you could say, Peter Rabbit as Peter Cottontail. He invented that name. And then Peter Cottontail was stolen by Gene Autry, and then also by Rankin Bass in the special that was done later.
Yeah, I was going to say that all of the
it.
names were completely changed in French. So, and they were all kind of weird, like kind of stupid names too. So I did compare the show to the Dumbchuck, it's Castor earlier. And I feel like as kids, we liked the other show better because the animals were more like humanized, anthropomorphed, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They were animals, but they like kind of acted like people and living in the forest. While this show, the animals are more animalistic. They wear some clothes, like a hat or.
They always wear one or two little pieces of clothing.
Yeah.
And that is straight from the books. In the original books, you see the illustrations.
The reality is very like animal based. Mm-hmm. And I think this is like the big difference between the two shows, and maybe why we could relate more to the show where the animals acted more human, if it makes any sense. I felt like the animals were depicted a little bit more like animalistic than in other shows about cute cartoon animals. I found it a bit like weird at the time. Maybe it was a bit harder to relate as a kid. And now as an adult, when I rewatched some of the episodes, I thought it was pretty cool the way they made you feel like you were in the shoes of those animals, and like the humans are the bad guys, and you experience like the real life issues that like animals in such a forest might face. And it's quite interesting, I feel.
Yeah. I found that the humans weren't depicted so much as villains, but they were very unpredictable.
Yeah.
Very mysterious. Like they don't understand why the humans, kill more than they need. They're never quite sure if they're gonna do something that will hurt them, or in the case with Tom, sometimes something that will help or protect them. I think there's a lot of neat little personality quirks with the animals. They're personified, or they're caricatures, but they all, in addition to having their little piece of clothing, there's always little traits about them that will remind you of the actual animals, and the way that they interact with each other is sort of consistent with how you would expect these actual animals to act. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into the characters that I guess you probably appreciate more as an adult when you're going back to look at it. One thing I also found very amusing is that they all wear those, they all have clothing, and it's Joe the Otter. He wears scuba gear, which is very funny. But from certain angles, it looks like he's wearing a kufi cap, which that's always what it looks like when I'm watching it. That also might just be because of the poor quality of these rips makes everything look a little strange. It always
looked like a scuba mask.
From certain angles you can tell it's clearly a scuba mask, and that it's a weird choice. Again, it's it gives them a little personality as well. And again, there's a lot of neat nuance. And as I kind of touched on before, it really feels like a lot of the characters have complex relationships as well. They're not all just buddies hanging out in the forest.
No man, I feel like half of the cast wants to eat the other half.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's a fox, and he definitely wants to eat the other animals, like a real fox would do.
Oh yeah,
Reddy kind of hanging together sometimes, and it's so weird.
Reddy Fox or LaRue, I think he is in French. Yeah. He's my favorite character for sure. He's definitely the most, I think, interesting character, and it shows the most in Japanese. In the English dub, actually, another thing we have to touch on is that there are actually multiple voice casts for Fables of the Green Forest in English. They each season has a different voice cast, but he kind of sounds like a sassy jerk trickster kind of person in English. In Japanese, Reddy he's a very insecure, nervous adolescent that really comes through in his voice, who he tries his best to act threatening and tough around the other animals. And, they kind of know how to deal with him, or exploit him in many cases as well. His threat only goes so far. But then when he's, there's one episode where he, there's a couple of episodes actually where he's just sort of interacting only with his grandmother who he lives with. And that's where he really comes through as a more vulnerable kind of character, especially when, again, they cross paths with the humans as well. So there's a lot of...
Didn't she look exactly like him, but in drags?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think the characterizations are really neat in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to qualify. I thought certain things when I watched it as a child, and then I thought many other things when I watched it as a grown-up. But as a kid, which was really the most exciting time to watch it, I think about the other programs that were on, roughly the same time. And this goes back a bit to what you were saying about the ecological themes in the show. We were watching the raccoons on CBC, and obviously, that's
an interesting contrast.
Well, it was, and I mean,
the raccoons were so much later.
Well, yeah, the first TV movie was 80, I want to say 82. The series was later, but I definitely remember, it was a similar program in that it was very concerned with animals and the forest, and the obviously raccoons, it was much more heavy-handed ecological messaging, but it was there in Fables. And there was another program, I don't know if it was shown dubbed in Quebec, called Hammy the Hamster, or Tales of the Riverbank, which was not animated, but it was actual mice and gerbils and wildlife that were filmed sort of driving Barbie cars and driving in boats and stuff in somebody's backyard. And then it had a narrator who was this guy Paul Sutherland, and it was all shot in Uxbridge, Ontario. So
and that never see that kind of stuff anymore.
Yeah, no, there's really nothing like that. And I always think about those programs all together because they were all about animals. And as you guys are saying, the characters, some of the characters in Fables were so vicious, and Freddy and the Blue Jay certainly were kind of terrifying as a kid. Like I was scared of it, and I think hopefully we can talk a bit about the music and just the way. I guess you guys are very familiar with Japanese animation and certainly the styles from that time and from that series. But again, out of context, it was very unsettling. And I think sandwiched between, as I said, on TVO, some of these other programs, but they were also showing a lot of just really weird stuff from other countries. So I think as a kid, it was like, that was part of the thrill of TV Ontario, was that you were going to get these programs that were, ostensibly for children, but they were kind of scary. And this would all culminate in Doctor Who coming on at 6 o'clock.
Right. They were for children, but they were for different kind of children.
Yes, but right, exactly.
Foreign one.
This is where they keep the weird stuff.
Yeah, no, it totally felt like that. And I think when I revisited it as a grown up, it was just trying to remember, like, what were you thinking when you were watching this? Because it really is fascinating,
Watching it now sure brought me back to that mindset I used to have as a kid. It brought back a lot of memories too. It was fun. Well, I gotta thank you, Jesse, for making me watch all of that old stuff and revisit my childhood like that. It's always interesting.
Always a pleasure to unearth this stuff for people. But yeah, of course I never watched TVO myself, but I think I kind of understand a lot of that sort of atmosphere that you get with all these sort of various shows from different parts of the world with wildly clashing tones, and the TAM identification logo showing up before a bunch of weird British shows.
Oh my God! No! I know. Don't talk about. Whenever that logo would show, like I knew for sure that whatever would follow would be fucking scary.
Well, I
think we had a lot of those shows in French too.
Yes, no, and we did get CBLT, which was Channel 25, which was I guess it was Ontario's version of Radio Canada. Like, it wasn't the same feed that I guess you would have got. And it was absolutely terrifying. And I a lot of young people that ask me about stuff on Retrontario. I think everything now is nowadays on linear broadcast television is very sanitized. It looks the same. It feels the same, whether it's a commercial or a logo or a show. And then you get on the streaming services, exactly the same. But of course, we have YouTube. We have all of these, wonderful BitTorrent sites where you can look at all this weird stuff. But that experience in the 80s, or, if you're old enough to remember even the late 70s, it was very, very unsettling. I keep saying that, but it was like you never quite knew what was going to come on next and what the vibe was going to be. I miss that.
We miss
because like TV was experimental as hell back then, and also like countries were more isolated, so whatever would come from a country would be very different from whatever would be like produced in another place. And it was like an adventure.
I mean, these days we can just like clearly organize all these TV shows, put them in order, label them properly, tell people where they're from, what they're about, and just categorize them so you can find them and browse through them as you like. But we've lost that sort of flow and ephemeral nature of just kind of throwing everything on the air and the vibe or atmosphere that creates. It's definitely something that is gone, and something that was unique on TVO and Knowledge Network and those channels. And I didn't see Fables of the Green Forest in that context. I only know it, of course, from watching episodes on YouTube, which is most of these episodes are on YouTube, by the way. There are a few missing, unfortunately. But you can watch most of the English dub there. Only one French episode is available.
Yeah, it's the one with the river, I think.
Yeah,
with the geese.
With Mr. Looking for Mr. Duck or the Search for Mr. Duck.
It wasn't Duck. It was a geese in French. I know it wasn't the Duck. No, it wasn't Duck. You're right.
The Search for Mr. Quack is what it was called. So I guess maybe it's more ambiguous.
Oh, and it's funny because I remember that in the show they would always refer, like you said, they were the Connecticut River.
Yeah,
I remember that in Quebec it was the river was called La Rivière La Grande, which is like an actual river in northern Quebec.
Oh wow!
And when I was a kid,
I thought they localized it.
Took place in Quebec, and I was like, like ground chucks and rabbit. It works. It's just kind of animals we have here.
Just like how King of the Hill takes place in southern Quebec.
Absolutely. They always do that. Even in The Simpsons, they make a lot of references to Montreal and whatever. It's so strange.
Yeah. Going back to what Ed said about the music in the show, it's interesting to point that out because the music that you hear in Fables of the Green Forest, and I think this applies to the French version as well, it was kind of hard to tell by the one episode that's available for the French version. But half the music in it is from the original Japanese.
Yeah, it does sound like the original
and it's
Japanese
very ethereal and atmospheric. The other half of the music was produced by the production company Ziv International. Worth noting that Ziv International, they were an LA-based licensing company. The two founders were Irv Hollander, who's he was a pretty typical kind of executive type. He went on to become the executive producer of Glow, Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, after he was done with Ziv. But
wow,
yeah. But the other guy who found it was Mark Mercury. He's from a band called Bullets, and he produced all the original music that was inserted into the silent moments, because of course it's World Masterpiece Theater especially, but Japanese programming, they're going to have a lot of silent moments to just sort of with no music happening, and you can't have that in
they would they still do that with Ghibli films. Well, at least
they have stopped doing that with Ghibli films. Yeah.
I noticed that when I would watch the Japanese version with the English subtitles, and the subtitle with subtitle stuff, that's like there's complete silence and subtitles just pop up, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
What the hell is going on?
Yeah, they did that with Castle in the Sky. They added a whole bunch of music, but they've removed it. They removed that extra music from the latest one. And, it's a thing that characterized Ghibli films, thing that characterized World Masterpiece Theater. Lots of silent moments filled in by Mr. Mark Mercury. And he also did the theme song as well. And I found that the music was, you could I find that once you know that, you can, and even if you're just not comparing the Japanese version to the dubbed version, you can tell a contrast between the original music and the filler music. The filler music's a lot cheerier, a lot sometimes doesn't feel like it fits.
Yeah, it's kind of jarring.
The original music has a lot more atmosphere to it. But Mark, actually, the music was a big part of it, because as we would see in later dubs, especially as Hayam Saban came into dominance with children's programming, licensing music and making royalties off of it is such a huge part of localizing.
Yeah. This is true, because I feel like most people in the English-speaking world know Hayam Saban because of the Power Rangers, but for us French Canadian kids, we would see his name plastered on every anime show that would come from France in the early.
That's where he started.
80s.
I know. Gnome's producer on Goldorak. But the thing is that, Mark Mercury, he was a headliner of this band called Bullets, and Ziv also did a couple of other dubs. They actually did a dub for Captain Harlock. They did a dub for Candy Candy. They did a dub for Captain Future. They did these just Toei licensed thing. They didn't do much of them. They only did a couple of episodes, but Mark Mercury did absolute killer theme songs for each one, especially Captain Harlock. It is an absolute bop. But those localizations never really went anywhere. They are lost media, apart from just a few clips that are floating around, and you'll see it. Some people will show at panels. People like Mike Toole or Dave Merrill will show those at panels at conventions. But that's kind of what he's best known for. After Ziv was sold to Lorimar Pictures in the late 80s, and then that got sold to Warner in 1993. I think that's why the whole new separate dub of Friends of the Forest happened later, because the rights just kind of fell into a black hole somewhere. But after Ziv kind of disappeared, Mark Mercury made his name known for doing planetarium music. That's what he's best known for today. So, and
he's called Mercury. He does planetarium music.
Not his real name, but I think it was still maybe an aspiration. Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's
if you're going to talk about the music, I'm going to talk about the theme song in French. I have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Like I said, if you would allow me.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Like I said earlier, I feel like this show is very remembered by people my age. It's like a lot of shows that just faded into obscurity. Not this one. People remember La Forêt Verte, but people don't remember anything about it aside from the theme song for some reason. And I don't know why. I guess it was weird and a bit cringe and a bit catchy at the same time.
It's very different from the English one.
Yeah, they would sing like what was the lyrics again? It was like c'est donc une fable de la forêt verte, allons-y tous ensemble, la porte est grande ouverte. But then they would have like a part where they would like name some animals and they would make noise, and it was like les canards, and the bird would go like.
Yeah. They
And there
yeah.
was the bird, and the
It's like they're
bird,
introducing each one, and then they make
yeah, and they
obnoxious
were like,
noises. Yeah.
for the beer, they would like they were going like notre ami le grand ours. And this line, everyone remembers for some, even kids who did not grow up with that have heard about the ho 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 ho. It's like a synonymous with like beer noises. And
I didn't realize it was so infamous.
I have no idea why. This always comes up in conversation whenever this show is brought up. People talk about the birds and the bears and the opening credit and the weird noise they would make.
That's
so strange.
That's so funny, Des, because in the English dub, the theme song is primarily what is remembered by Gen X, but it's totally different from that.
Different.
Yeah.
It was just weird.
And we'd be remiss, Jesse, if we didn't talk about the kind of weird home video life of Fables.
Yeah. So there's never been anything to, I think it's commonly assumed that Fables of the Green Forest, the dub, was produced in Canada. I have actually found no evidence of that. There's no cast list. We don't know who the cast was on the show. And this show has 2 casts too.
It's crazy how little information there is on that. I tried to find out if the show, like the French version, was translated from the English one or from the Japanese one directly, and I couldn't find that information anywhere.
Well, we'll talk about the French cast in just a bit, but there were two. Yeah, there were 2.
Something about that.
Yeah, there were 2 casts for the English version. If you watch the episodes now, I believe they're resequenced to be in the original order as the airing in Japan. But if you like, the first chunk has 1 cast, and that you hear that cast in some like random episodes in the middle, and then in the final winter arc they come back, but the rest of the episodes have a completely different cast for the show.
That's so weird.
What I suspect, and maybe Ed can confirm this, I think that the first season consisted of like the first few episodes, a few episodes in the middle, and then the final episodes, and then for the second season they went back and redubbed everything with a completely new cast. I don't know if you remember that, or if that was the case during the first airing at all. But that's kind of what I pieced together.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember noticing that then. I mean, I notice it now. I don't remember it then. And I must say, the VHS, there was a release by Media, which was, mostly horror films, really, at that time. And goodness only knows how it has the Ziv card at the beginning.
Yeah, well, Ziv obviously made this dub to get it on TV. I don't think they wanted to get it on TVO. I don't think they made it with TVO. I think TVO is kind of
they
where
were just the broadcaster.
That's just where it ended up. But the only life that it had outside of, actually 30 episodes aired in the UK. It was cut short, but they did get some of it there. But in the United States, and for the most part outside of Canada, the only life it had was on these VHS tapes that's released, and each one would be based around one of the characters and have like 2 episodes focusing on that character. I think you showed me the one you had, and I think Dave Merrill has this one as well. It's the Chatterer the Squirrel.
Well, yeah. That was the later release. The initial the initial release was just a standard. It was called Fables of the Green Forest. It was a mixture of episodes. It had one opening at the beginning. It was almost like a movie version, in that they took 3 or 4 episodes and stuck the credit at the beginning and then at the end. That one is on my YouTube channel. That's just a rip of the Media VHS. Yeah. And I always found that weird, like I said, because I associated that label with like John Carpenter's Halloween and, like just random horror films. But then those later releases, of which I have Chatterer the Squirrel, I've seen a few others, they were in those kind of oversized VHS boxes. Like they weren't distributed by Media. They were, I think it was, the company was called Charter. I could be wrong about that, but it was a total fly by night operation. And those ones, I don't think they have the Ziv logo at the beginning. But I think you're correct that each one was focused on a character. So yeah, I mean, again, it's the mystery of all this stuff. Even though there were home video releases, in fact, the media copy that I have, I found it in Florida in a thrift store in Florida, which was super weird. Yeah, there's just so much documented about other releases, but there's just question marks with all these. So
yeah, there's not very much known about Ziv International, but I think there was a lot of hustle going on in the background, and they just kind of got content out in any way that they could, wherever they could, which probably resulted in weird deals like that with companies you wouldn't expect.
Yeah,
I never even heard of them.
Yeah, they're a very obscure company. This is one of the few things that they're really known for.
And now I feel like if the French version had been translated from that version, we would have seen the Ziv logo. Maybe they would have kept a similar version of the theme song. I guess.
Yeah, the Ziv logo is at the beginning of the French version.
Is it?
Yeah, it is.
Oh,
check.
Then okay, but there you go.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, so it was sub-licensed from them for that French dub for sure.
I definitely did not remember that.
Yeah,
I'll trust you.
And Jesse, to your point or to your question about TVO's involvement, that was something I was able to discuss with a programmer from that era who I interviewed many years ago. The focus of the conversation was not solely on any one program; it was more their programming strategy of that era of the late 70s. And what the woman explained to me was just that they were going to the big conference in France every year. I guess it's called MIPCOM now, but yeah, I it's called something else back then. And they were buying these, whether they were UK programs or Australian programs or French programs. And the way that she explained it to me was, like you were saying, they were just these really small time outfits with a business card. And they were like writing on the back of napkins, like there's 52 episodes of this and there's 100 episodes of that or whatever. And this has a dub and this needs a dub. And the impression I got from the list of programs I reviewed with her was that, TVO being the broadcaster in Canada opened up other avenues for them to exploit, but TVO had no input into any production decisions or anything of that nature. So yeah, I think, if someone out there is very serious about wanting to understand the provenance of this whole thing, the Ziv people, it seems like that's the next place to go, right?
Yeah, I think it will always be a little bit of a mystery to a degree. And also that, like, the hands-off kind of nature of TVO, I think that's kind of what made its content special, because it emphasizes all just coming from these disparate sources and all kind of coming under one really eclectic umbrella. And I think it's important thing to note and not get confused about with looking at what Fables of the Green Forest was.
How did these people do it? Like back in the 80s, like in 70s, make contacts in Japan without the internet and bring back shows. And I bet most of the time they didn't even speak the language.
No, it was all done over drinks, man. Just like the
This is like so weird to me thinking about it as an adult now with everything we have.
Yeah. Ed, I had one other question about TVO. I've heard of many stories of kids watching Fables of the Green Forest in schools. Because TVO is very tied, unlike other, like this wasn't the case with Knowledge Network. But
I forgot to mention that, but we did in Quebec watch that show in class, and when I was in first or second grade.
Wow, really?
Yeah, I mean, TVO was like, they answered to the provincial government, and they fell in, under the education portfolio. So it was built into curriculum. A lot of the programs they produced themselves came with teachers' guides and all kinds of cool books that were part of the in classroom experience. However, things like Fables and Barba Papa were definitely shown. But what it was is the teacher would literally record it off of television.
Oh, okay.
And TVO had a wonderful thing for teachers where they called it time shifting, where at 4 a.m., between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., they would just basically marathon a series for teachers to set their VCR to record so they could get a tape full of a certain show. I mean, it was so antiquated when you think about it now, but I know people that said they were up in the middle of the night, in the late 80s, and Fables of the Green Forest came on, and it was on for like 3 hours just back to back, and it would have been one of those blocks that was meant for teachers to record. So yeah, there's all kinds of just funny, weird stuff like that with the TVO history.
Oh.
Just the storm's getting kind of bad, and I got to go deal with a couple of things. So unfortunately, I got to sign off. But I think you guys can take it from here now.
Okay,
right.
Ed, where can folks find you on social media?
We're at retrontario.com. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, Instagram feed, all that jazz. But visit the site and learn about Ontario's TV history.
It's so great to have you on.
My pleasure.
So we'll say goodbye here, but Etienne and I will just wrap up from this point forward. All right, so we'll just finish this off with the two of us because unfortunately Ed had to leave early. We were talking earlier about the cast, and I wanted to just go back around and talk about the French cast. As I mentioned, the English cast is a total mystery. I did read that apparently Jonathan Winters from It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, apparently Ziv originally was going to get him to do all the voices on the show, which is a very bizarre decision, but that didn't work out. And also, it would not have been his first anime because he was in the Alakazam the Great movie dub from the 1960s. But we do have a little bit of information on the voices in the French version, and from what I can tell, they're mostly the same people that we hear in a lot of other Quebec dubs, like in Minifay and and Candy Candy, like Flora Belzano, Jean Fontaine, and a lot of people doing the same voices in different characters.
This is one thing I noticed when I was a kid, is that characters sounded more Quebecois than what I was used to at the time.
Yeah,
I kind of could tell that there was something different with that show.
Yeah, because I know
people sounded more like real people in Quebec that like.
Oh, that's interesting because I know that a lot of the Quebec dubs, the actors try to sound neutral.
They try to sound neutral, but
yeah,
you can always tell they're not French for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And this show, I could tell even as a kid that these people are from here. It kind of.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Even when you try to sound neutral, like some of the tiny accents or inflections would be different.
Yeah, I didn't realize that they gave it such a local flavor. That's kind of, and also just saying, like, explicitly saying that it's set in Quebec as well. But
the funny thing about that
notable.
Cast, I'm looking at the cast list right here, and they have like fucking Yves Corbeil among the crew. I don't know if you know him. This guy is huge. He's one of the most well-known actors and voice actors in Quebec. He's got a career that spanned more than 5 decades, I guess, and
vaguely familiar with him.
He's very well known,
Yeah.
And I'm very surprised to see him pop as a voice and a random voice in such an old.
He's the blue jay. He's blah blah.
He did the bird.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I really did not recognize him. Like, it would always speak like, and no, that's the bird from the Cities of Gold. How did the J sound? I forgot, but definitely not like Yves Corbeil sounds usually. This guy he's got a deep voice. Hello, I'm Yves Corbeil. He used to do like the lottery numbers on TV and stuff like that. His voice is very familiar. Whenever he dubs someone in the movie, everybody recognizes him all the time, and it kind of breaks the immersion. Like you hear Arnold Schwarzenegger speaking with that guy's voice, and you're like, that doesn't work. That's not.
Or you just see Jeff Goldblum in anything, and it's just like it's Jeff Goldblum.
Yep, that same energy.
Yeah,
man, it's amazing. And then he is the only person I really recognize in that cast. Like you said, the other one, I guess, are more like dubbing actors from
Yeah.
the
Again,
70s and
a lot of the same people you see in the other, or you'd hear in the other
who the hell is Jean
Quebec dubs.
Fontaine? Artiste de doublage. Okay, yeah, he's done a lot of dubs and a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's neat
So
that they
great.
it's neat that they I can kind of understand, I think, why they go with more of a localization approach with the French dub, because I guess there wasn't really any intention to export that version internationally, and
Nah,
it's in a
and we were
it's in
not
a natural.
familiar. We were not familiar with the source material either, so I guess
Yeah,
they felt like they could do anything they wanted with it.
and it's a very like natural setting, gives a lot of flexibility,
Hmm.
sort of like a more rural area. You could even interpret it as well. So, it's kind of a fertile thing to work with in that
Hmm.
regard. So yeah, I can kind of see how it worked
That
that
show
way.
could have been set anywhere in North America, really. Well,
Yeah.
maybe not Florida, but you know,
um,
everywhere where there's a winter.
One thing I was hoping to talk about more when Ed was on was that second dub, Friends of the
Ah,
Forest. So it is a mystery. It's claimed to have run on TV Ontario from October 3rd, 1993 to January 18th, 1998. We don't really know anything about it. The only reason we really know that it exists is because there was an advertisement for it that has been preserved, and you can find that online. What's interesting about this version is that they call the main character Rocky instead of Johnny. So in the Japanese version, of course,
like a Japanese name.
yeah, even though it's Johnny in the original books, he is Rocky in the Japanese version, and it's changed back to Johnny in Fables of the
Like
Green
the book.
Forest. And in the
Okay.
French version, he's Tobon.
Toubon, yeah.
Tubon.
Oh yeah, because all of the names kind of mean something. Like Toubon would
Yeah.
sound like all it's all good. C'est Toubon. Garion is a type of rabbit. The blue jay was called blah blah, which is blah 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 blah, like to speak. But I especially like, I almost forgot to talk about that. The skunk. The skunk in French was called tupudu, which sounds a lot like pardon my French, tupu du cul, which would mean your ass smells.
Yeah.
So, and it's a skunk.
He's
Even as a kid, this was so weird.
he's Jimmy. He's Jimmy
Jimmy,
in the
yeah.
original. I love his design. I love the skunk's design. He's one of my favorite designs in the show for sure. He's got that just big round nose. It looks kind of wrong for a skunk, but it's really distinct.
Because
Um,
I was always happy to see skunks pop up and stuff because, like, French people don't know about skunks. So whenever a skunk appears in something that was dubbed in France, they just always like change the name for another animal they have over there that smells bad. And this was always wrong to me as a kid. But in that show, he was what we call the skunk in French and in Quebec, moufette. So even as a kid, I was like, this is a moufette. This is perfect. Why
yeah.
is this show using the right terminology and the other ones don't? But this is something that growing up as a French Canadian kid was always frustrating because whatever would be dubbed in France would never use the local terminology.
Yeah.
Like like a submarine sandwich. In Quebec, we call that a sous-marin, which is the French for submarine. But in stuff that would be dubbed in France, they would always call it just a sandwich because that's just how they call it. Maybe they don't even know what a submarine is over there. Who knows? And it used to annoy me, to annoy the hell out of me. So I remember that watching this show felt right because of that. You know what I mean? Because it was
Yeah.
dubbed in Quebec, and they used the word I was familiar with.
Yeah. And again, there was lots of shows that were dubbed in Quebec, but this one, I guess it just kind of had a cozy, familiar approach to it. Yeah. Back to that Friends of the Forest dub.
Yeah.
It's documented that it aired on YTV. I don't think that that's true. I haven't really heard any compelling case that that's the case. And also, I was chatting with Ed beforehand, and he used to work at YTV, and he
Okay.
never found any evidence of that ever airing on the network. And also, I never saw it because I watched a lot of YTV as a kid and I don't remember the show at all. So I think that's incorrect. But I think what happened with this is probably that TVO or some person who was involved or some group that was involved with Fables of the Green Forest wanted to keep it on the air, but Ziv didn't exist anymore and they couldn't kind of locate the rights or anything, and it was probably just relicensed and redubbed and just kind of relocalized because again, Johnny became Rocky again in that version, which is one of the few things we know about it. So that's true lost media right there. And hopefully it'll turn up one day, because I'm very curious about it.
Lost media is always sad.
Especially, yeah. I mean, you got, like I said before, you got a lot of people claiming that something that's not on YouTube, or it's been out of print for a couple years.
But yeah, like the
real lost media.
Like the French version is not on YouTube at all. Yeah. I guess, like I said earlier, I think that this show was not very popular with people. We all remember it, but was not a hit with anybody I know. So I guess, and since the French people, the Frenchmen did the French people never got that show. I guess a lot less people in the French-speaking world got exposed to it. And
true lost media is tragic. It really is. There's one last thing I wanted to mention here. I was talking a little bit before about Peter Rabbit and Peter Cottontail, and how Burgess in his stories changed the name of the character over time, and then that name got stolen. They did an episode of that in Fables of the Green Forest. It's episode 43, where Peter decides to change his name because he doesn't think his name's cool and people aren't taking him seriously.
Oh man.
So he changes his name to Peter Cottontail, and this is like Sister Southwind, and that's the other thing we didn't really touch on about this show before, is that the seasons are personified, and the Sister Southwind, the voice of the wind, is like a character who she originally guides Rocky or Johnny to the Green Forest, where
I remember that.
He finds his home, and she's basically just shitting all over Peter for changing the name that God gave him. And then he just he gets on his high horse with his new name, and it just creates a whole bunch of trouble. And they're just like, oh, you shouldn't have changed your name. You should have obeyed God and retained your current name, which is a very weird way of putting it. And watching that now, it just, and like, this definitely wasn't the intention, but when I watch it now, I'm just like, oh, this the way this plays out, this sounds like some kind of anti-transgender narrative written by some alt-right weirdo.
Oh my god, you're right.
Yeah, and if you watch the episode, it's probably similar. Well, the French version is not available,
but I really wonder what they did in the French version, considering his name was not anything.
His name was completely different. Yeah, so it was. Yeah. It probably was a little different in that version. But yeah, episode 43, that's absolutely bizarre. Yeah.
This is so weird when you watch old stuff and like something like that happens, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is weird.
Yeah, but
this wouldn't fly anymore.
But again, it wasn't the intention at the time, but it just kind of takes on this unfortunate new narrative now.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I would say the show has aged pretty well. It's kind of hard to recommend. If you're nostalgic for it as an adult, like, I don't think you're going to want to sit through the whole thing, but it's worth checking a few episodes out. But the episodes are in such poor condition that it's kind of hard to watch.
Might as well just watch the Japanese version.
It hasn't been fully subtitled, though. It looks amazing, though. There's a Blu-ray out of Fables of the Green Forest in Japan. You can probably find that version out there somewhere. And only a couple episodes have been subtitled, but you compare that Blu-ray version to the TV rips of the old dubs that are floating around. Oh my god, it's such a contrast. It looks so good. Yeah, it actually kind of changes the show a bit for me. It has those old recordings, they do retain a little bit of that TVO atmosphere, I think you could say. But the Blu-ray rips, it's so bright and vibrant. It's too bad that you could probably never get decent quality audio and reconcile it and match it up with that Blu-ray footage. Because if you could make a nice remaster of that show. But I don't think that the materials exist, or the willing manpower exists to do that properly.
No matter how much you remaster something visually, you always can tell it's old because of the sound.
Yeah. And I'm not sure what kids would think of watching something that looks this old at this point. I don't know if kids can tell the difference.
It's a good question. I guess it depends from kid to kid. I know, like, one of my friends' kid really loves to watch old anime, and she's like,
yeah. I guess I'm underestimating children.
It always depends.
Yeah. Can't expect everyone to stay in their lane, or or do as expected. Hey, we were saying how kind of boring it gets when everything is neatly laid out for you and organized and easy to navigate, and you know what everything is. Sometimes you need something a little weird and dark and mysterious, and hopefully there are
a little chaos.
Hopefully there are kids stumbling on these old Fables of the Green Forest dubs on YouTube. I hope there aren't that many kids wandering around YouTube discovering like Andrew Tate videos or whatever. Hopefully they're finding this instead. It's a better thing to stumble on.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, Etienne. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Did you have any final thoughts to share before we end it?
Because I had to rewatch that show, I have the theme song stuck in my head again. Thank you for that. And I have, like I said, I have no idea what kind of weird property that song had to influence an entire generation of French Canadian kids who remember the show, the song, but not without anything that happened in the show.
You know what? I'm not going to complain about any legacy it's left behind. I think it's a positive thing.
You remember it, and it opened the door for more Japanese stuff, which is always good.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll end it there. So Etienne, can you just let everyone know where they can find you on social media or anywhere online?
First of all, thanks for having me again. And you can find, if anybody can find me on Twitter at Omega Des, and on the website of my webcomic, which is frivolesque.com, FRIVOLSQUE. Man, I can spell in English.com.
Yeah, and thanks for tuning into Zon in Canada. You can reach me on Twitter at jbetteridge or email zonincanada@gmail.com. The theme song is by Ultraclystron and can be found on his album Packet Flood, and you can find that at ultraclystron.com. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast app of choice. See you again.
Les moineaux, notre ami le grand ours, c'est la fête dans la forêt verte. Elle compte une fable de la forêt verte, tout le monde s'y amuse, elle n'est jamais déserte, avec la joie et l'amour dans tous les cœurs, on y découvre que des images de bonheur.
Trouble! Forgetting about Buster Bear's pursuing drought. Reddy Fox's radar snout is sniffed out as prey. In the green forest, the laughing brook chuckles all day. Paddy Beaver's building a dam. Joe the Otter tells him scram. Chatterers upon the lamb. Oh, what a sight! In the green forest, you may see an occasional fight. Peter Rabbit hippity hops, the mean old weasel growls. Grandpa Froggy flippity flops, and Sammy Blue Jay scowls. There are margins, mink and sables there, toads on mushroom tables there, 4 and 50 fables there of friendship and strife. In the green forest, the stories you've read about all come to life. Yes, the